This film is part of a series in which experts talk about the core concepts in educational assessment and tackle some tricky issues. I'm Professor Joanne Baird from the Oxford University Centre for Educational Assessment. In this film, we focus upon digital assessments, their promises, some breakthroughs in the field, and the unresolved issues. In the discussions of digital assessments that follow, it's worth bearing in mind that not all assessments are summative, coming at the end of the course. Neither do all assessments have high stakes associated with them for the test taker or the teacher. Some assessments are formative in nature and are all about finding out what the student knows and can do so that feedback can be provided to support their learning. In fact, many of the advances in digital assessment have been under these formative conditions and associated with digital tutoring. More of this later. Breakthroughs in technology have enabled a particular approach to assessment, stealth assessment. This is a term coined by Professor Valerie Schutt, and it refers to collecting data on learners when they're not necessarily aware of the assessment process. This can be done, for example, when people are playing computer games. We asked a couple of our experts what claims are made for the promises of digital assessment. First, let us turn to Professor Rebecca Inan from Oxford University. Professor Inan's research is on digital education. Then we hear from Professor Alina von Davier, who is Chief of Assessment at Duolingo, the company who produced the highly popular language learning app.
A number of claims that people often make about the potential of digital assessment. One of them is around how efficient these systems might be and make assessment more cost effective. Another one that we're seeing increasingly as people think much more about AI technologies or data-intensive technologies is that these systems allow us to see the processes of learning in really fine-grained detail in ways that are very difficult to do with other kinds of methods of assessment. And the third thing that we often hear is around objectivity. So obviously humans can be biased, they can get tired, and all of these things influence assessment practices. And people often argue that technology is a more objective way of assessing students. And a fourth thing that we might also hear about is how digital technologies may enhance the potential of assessment. So through, for example, using real-world simulations or through adaptive real-time feedback to students.
So the main promises of the digital assessment are definitely democratization of education. So with digital assessment, we have the opportunity to reach out to more students and provide them with access to education, provide them with the opportunity of taking tests in a much more comfortable and more affordable way that they had in the past. And in this way, they can actually display their skills and talents in a more organic, natural way.
Of course, social inequalities produce digital divides, and there are different views about the extent to which digital assessment will produce more equal societies. Computers have been used in assessment since the 70s when they were used to mark multiple choice tests. Since then, there have been a number of important advances. The recent developments in generative AI might be expected to have a lasting impact on the design of assessments. But breakthroughs in natural language processing and the measurement models underlying digital assessments have also been key. Professor Art Gracer from the University of Memphis explains the developments in natural language processing, which he refers to as computational linguistics. Art founded the Institute for Intelligent Systems at the University of Memphis.
The fields that have had a tremendous transformative impact, I think, on assessment are really computational linguistics and artificial intelligence that tracks natural language processing. And so kind of the progress has based not only interpreting what the learner says, but also generating information. So let me talk a little bit about interpreting what the student says. Advances in AI or computational linguistics have reached the point that it can really uh, assess the quality of what the student says almost as good, if not better, sometimes than experts. And that's big progress. If you're grading an essay or an answer to a question and you expect the student to articulate 3 or 4 sentences, then uh, the ability of these semantic analyzers is so good that it matches, it can evaluate whether they cover it, and then you ask experts, is it covered? And the computer can spot those matches as good as human experts. And that's great because uh, often people don't like to grade answers to questions like in homework, or they don't like to grade essays. Here's computer systems that can do it as good as, if not better sometimes, than experts, because experts often get tired, fatigue. And they often don't use the best heuristics in grading them in the first place. So that's a major advance. Now on the generative side, of course, um, we're right in the era of generative AI, where ChatGPT-4 allows people to ask a question or request an essay on a topic, and it can generate great-looking essays. You might have to check for the facts and whether it's correct, or make sure there's no misinformation, but pretty impressive. Now, ChatGPT-4 and OpenAI has taken the world by storm during the last year, and people are trying to figure out how to integrate it into classes, and some people are very skeptical about it for plagiarism. However, my view is these generative AIs are not really assessments alone. You can't really assess anything. It presents information, but it's not assessing what the student is doing. And so you need to figure out a way to use this powerful tool as an assessment device. One example that I think would be great in the future is to see how well students can generate prompts or questions or requests of this system in order to get a particular product, whether it's an essay or a procedure or whatever. And so that can help with inquiry learning and again, self-regulated learning. So that can be very powerful. So those are the two fields that I think have made major strides.
Alina von Davy has also forged ahead with her work on the underlying assessment models, which she calls computational psychometrics. These developments were possible due to her background in assessment theory, mathematics, and programming. Here she explains what they are and why they've been so important.
So computational psychometrics is a blend of psychometric theory that most of the time is top down. So someone thinks of a theory, develops a psychometric model, and then goes and collects the data. So that's one piece. The other piece, the other part of the blend, is machine learning. Machine learning has models and algorithms that are data driven. In other words, it starts with the data, looks for patterns, and then based on those patterns, identifying which are the most relevant, looking for the relationship among those, creates a model. So computational psychometric is trying to put these two together. And the work started about 10 years ago now. Actually 2012, 2013. when I started to understand what it means for psychometrics to have simulations and games as part of the assessment. And these opportunities to collect data mean that we also need tools to make sense out of this rich data. We have process information, we have timing information, and we also did not really have a theory for that. So a lot of the work in the 2012 to 2020, I would say, and still even now, a lot of the work is done into exploring process data, into trying to understand what's happening. So in my work, I try to propose that we do both, that we continue to do psychometric models as much as possible in order to guide the data collection. But we are also open to what many in computer science call knowledge discovery. So identifying out of the data what are the relevant features and how those could influence the model, and then change the model as needed. So examples of applications for this are automatic essay scoring. So a part of the work is machine learning and data driven, where large sets of essays are analyzed and features are extracted. Features relevant to a successful essays are extracted. But they also have a psychometric model that in general considers which features of the essays should contribute to a score and how that relationship to ability in a particular domain should be formulated. So now we are putting these things together. The features that were extracted using machine learning, and then put them all in a psychometric framework and have a model that link that to the ability. And then use the psychometric framework for reliability, differential item functioning, and validity, and all the other elements that make the assessment and measurement efforts worthwhile, especially again for high stakes tests. So in computational psychometrics, we've been, and my colleagues Bob Mislevy and Zhanggang Cao, we've been arguing that we need to be a bit more intentional on collecting big data than it has been the case in, say, learning analytics or in other area of data analytics in general. In most of those cases, the data have been accidentally collected. You know, it all started saying in marketing, where data about different products was just available. And then people started to identify the main features and create models and predictions, which is wonderful. But we think that for an assessment goal, one needs to be a bit more intentional. And by being more intentional, then the two models are going to get and be more connected than otherwise. So the difference from the traditional psychometrics is that within this framework, we acknowledge that there is information in the data that is outside of the psychometric theory, and that could be helpful for updating the psychometric model that we are working on. We are also acknowledging that there is valuable information in the psychometric theory to augment and even constrain the data from extracted from the big data using machine learning technologies. So it's an interesting combination here because, and argumentation. When I used to work for psychometric companies, I had to convince them of the value of machine learning algorithms and the data extraction. Now that I'm in a tech company, I have to convince them on the value of the psychometrics and the value of reliability and the concept of validity and the concept of fairness. So it's quite interesting that these domains used to be so different from each other, but now we see more and more that that they converge.
Okay, with all of these claims' advantages and these breakthroughs in the field, a question that occurs is, why don't we see more digital assessments? This is particularly true in high-stakes school leaving examinations. Other than multiple choice tests, very few testing agencies around the world have gone digital, though we did see some countries do this during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ofqual, the examinations regulator in England, produced a very interesting report on the barriers to digital assessment in high-stakes contexts. They identified issues with IT provision in schools, internet capabilities, staff expertise, security and planning. Overall, the high-stakes nature of the school leaving examinations makes the industry more risk-averse. Let's hear from Alina von Davier about her thoughts on why we have not seen more uptake of digital assessments.
Yeah, I think these were the main obstacles. The incumbents, the companies that have their business relying on test centers. Don't underestimate them. They are very powerful, have a lot of funds put into the marketing and into pushing for that. The second is the lack of, or the dissonance between online testing and old-fashioned tests that have been put online, and glitches that led to that. The third is the human fear of change. And I would say the fourth probably is that some of the companies who did try to put their tests online and work with partners use this live proctoring, and that often has not been successful. Sometimes it's successful, but not always. And created these anecdotal stories, all these things, anecdotes. And then last but not least, the fact that test centers are not a gold standard yet. Many refer to that as such.
One of the things that Alina referred to was our familiarity with the idea of testing happening under controlled conditions in test centres, and people thinking of this as a gold standard. There may be a number of challenges to how we think of assessment under digital conditions. We heard earlier about the claims that are made for the promises of digital assessment, but do they deliver on those claims? Let's hear what Professor Inan had to say.
So it's quite difficult to decide if digital technologies always deliver on these claims, because it really depends on the context and the nature of the technologies being used. So for example, if we're thinking about efficiency and effectiveness, if there's been a decision that multiple choice questionnaires or short answer responses are the most appropriate way to assess something, then absolutely technologies may well make that process more efficient, particularly if we take care of things like making sure that everyone knows how to use the technologies. We've taken care of the design over things like data protection and so on. But as we move to having more data-centric systems, more AI-enabled technologies, then these sorts of questions become much more complicated. And this is partly because at the moment, a lot of this work is still in its infancy. So while we're starting to see some really exciting insights into how people are learning, the processes of learning that we may be able to assess with these systems, it's actually really quite hard to know how much value these systems are currently adding to the kinds of decisions we would already be making about many students in different educational settings. Alongside these kind of challenges, we're also seeing this concern about bias in digital technologies and digital assessment. So we often see people assuming that technology is this really neutral tool that is kind of better than humans. But of course, technologies have been built by humans, so they have everybody's biases, assumptions built into them. And they're trained on data and can only be trained on data that is available, which tends to be quite partial, tends to privileged, those that are kind of noisier online, or better connected, so richer. And so the systems that we then build are also biased and may favour particular groups of students. And one of the quite worrying things in education is that while in other areas of life, in health and social care, in justice, for example, they've been really thinking about these issues for a long time, in education we're not seeing so much testing of these systems for bias, particularly if we're looking at things like formative assessment. So there are some challenges there. And I think even with questions about how we might enhance our assessment practices through digital technologies, there's some really exciting potential there. But at the same time, a lot of these ways of assessing people require a huge amount more data from individuals. And I think there becomes a moment really where we have to think about, well, is this amount of data moving towards a kind of risk of these tools becoming more of a form of surveillance rather than a form of assessment?
I mentioned earlier the idea of stealth assessment through data collected whilst people are playing video games. These days our digital footprints provide a lot of detailed information about us. With such a lot of data available about us from our medical records, online searches, GPS trackers for our locations, CCTV footage, electronic correspondence and so on. Depending on the kind of assessments we want to make, this could be put to use. And of course, there will be further technological breakthroughs, such as wearable devices that could track our eye movements, physical responses, and other data that we haven't even envisaged yet. This could be very intrusive, and there are significant concerns regarding how all of this is to be managed. Let's hear more from Professor Inan on surveillance and datafication, and then from Professor Gracer, who discusses the ethical issues as he sees them.
So obviously technology, I think, is going to be a really important part of assessment and the ways that we assess students. But I think what's really interesting in this shift towards AI and data-intensive technologies is how we've moved from a situation where assessments often happen at very particular times, at high-stakes moments of summative assessment or very specific formative assessments, to a time where, because we have all of the possibilities of this data, means that we're building more and more systems that kind of carry through the whole educational experiences that students have. So we might, for example, in a school setting, see that young people can log into their learning management system, and there'll be all sorts of data there visualized about how they've engaged with particular resources, how much of their homework they've completed, how well they've done on a test in relation to their peers. And this information is also used by teachers to make judgments about those students. We're also seeing increasing kind of real-time assessments. So students might be writing an essay and they might get an immediate prompt into how to write slightly more effectively or more concisely. And another example might be that a student is playing a maths game and they might pause for a moment, and the system might see that they've kind of paused and try and encourage them to get back on task. And so there's this constant datafication really of their experiences of learning that go well and far beyond really what we saw in kind of more traditional forms of summative and formative assessment. And I think we have to ask ourselves then, is this still assessment, or are we at risk of kind of surveilling our students through the collection and use of this data at all moments of school practice?
As we all know, the world is struggling with various ethical concerns about digital assessment as well as artificial intelligence. And people are concerned about equity, bias, privacy, transparency of the systems, whether people understand them enough. They can't completely understand them, but understand them enough. And how the data is used. So they want to know who else can see the data. And of course, if it's a student in a classroom, they want to know whether their parents will see the data or things like that. So I think the whole world needs to come up with good policies on sharing data and have ethical use of building these systems. I think that's going to be very important. Now, I've always had and others have had this dream of a digital uh, learning and experience portfolio. You know, people used to talk about learning portfolios of students where you see what things they've created. You'd also get scores in courses and things like that, but it was really a record of what they've accomplished. And and people have emphasized personalized learning, where you want uh, uh, the learning to be tailored to individuals. Well, I like that vision, but that's a lot of data being stored about a person, and um, it'll probably be difficult to have the various stakeholders share whatever data they have. I mean, right now it's hard for a college professor to get scores of students in other courses, and or even in high school. So the instructor really doesn't know much about the students. They don't know what accomplishments they've had in their life, or whether they've produced music, or whether they've written an interesting article. You know, they don't have that. And so that's going to be a barrier. And until we sort out these ethical issues, um, it, it, every all of our advancements in digital assessment will be piecemeal. Um, but it's kind of interesting. People don't care too much about the business world tracking their data. You know, I mean, some people do, but a lot of their data is tracked when they navigate the web and select things, and they don't worry about that. But when it comes to learning, a lot of people are concerned about the whole privacy issue and worried about sharing data and how data is going to be used. So I think that's one of the difficulties that the schools, the countries, the world has to solve. And I think it's going to take an international effort to sort out those issues.
We've heard in this film that digital assessments have seen major breakthroughs in the past couple of decades that have made them much more useful. But we recognise that they've not been implemented as widely as in high-stakes school leaving assessments as was predicted. Researchers have identified a number of reasons for this, real barriers that need to be circumvented if there's to be a shift in this direction. The promises of digital assessment are wide-ranging now, and developments in technology could rapidly shift their capabilities. Effects of digital assessment and of datafication in education more broadly are of significant concern ethically. Transparency and regulation will be needed. For all of the potential advantages of digital assessment, their effects on learners and on the human experience is central. But developers of these systems may have different agendas, including simply being innovative with technology without necessarily having an understanding of the impacts on humans interacting with these systems, or an understanding of educational assessment. We've all experience of being stuck in digital systems, trying to get a response to an important issue, but being sent around the same loops. Professor von Davier spoke to us separately about her vision of the future for digital assessments, which could look like the holodeck on the science fiction series Star Trek. In such a system, highly authentic assessments would be possible, and it would be difficult for the learner to distinguish between the digital and the real world. Well, we're still some way off this, but advances in virtual reality are already affecting the kinds of assessments that are possible. We hope you've found this video interesting. If you're interested in watching more of our films, you can find them on our website at the Oxford University Centre for Educational Assessment. The link is here. We hope you find them helpful.